All right, welcome everyone. My name is Celine Bilgin, and I am so delighted to have a very special guest on today. His name is Dr. Emeran Mayer. He is so many things, and a few of them is that he's a gastroenterologist, a lecturer, an editor, a neuroscientist, and a documentary filmmaker of the award-winning documentary In Search of Balance. He's also a professor of the Department of Medicine, Physiology and Psychiatry at UCLA. He is a pioneer. We're just talking about before recording how there has been an increased interest in this work. And we do believe that whether it's situations of the world or really people are really becoming more interested in their health, their well-being. And Dr. Amran, you have been a leading investigator and expert in the world of microbiome interactions. You have also been featured in Impact Theory, which is a podcast I adore. You've been lecturing at Google, TedxUCLA, National Public Radio, PBS, and many more. And you actually had your best-selling book, The Mind-Gut Connection, back in 2016. And just yesterday, it's I mean, you probably, maybe it was even before yesterday, but it's the #1 bestseller in cognitive neuroscience and neuropsychology, again, and #2 in gastroenterology on Amazon. You also have your upcoming book this 2021 and it's called The Gut Immune Connection, How Understanding Why We're Sick Can Help Us Regain Our Health. So you're a busy man and you chose to be here. Thank you so much and welcome.
Well, thanks, Celine, for inviting me, and thanks for this introduction. Hard to live up to these expectations that you built up, so I'll try to do my best to do that. So
I
thank you.
love it. Oh my gosh, thank you. So we have a number of questions to go over, and really I want to start with your book because it's not only scientific, you don't also have to be a gastroenterologist to understand the book. It's also philosophical. It's almost even spiritual in nature. It's science, like it has so many worlds in one. And so I really want to dive into your book. And something that you noted is that our gut is actually lined with endocrine cells as well. And as I specialize in women's hormone health, can you speak to us a little bit about even why you think these cells are there and how that relates to hormone health in the first place?
Yeah, so if you put, so I mean, thanks for, the positive comments on the book. This was clearly something that I wanted to um, pack in a lot of information, both personal that I've experienced in my career, as you said, philosophical, spiritual, so personal experiences, but also a lot of science. So it's a plus and a minus. For some people, it just looked at for a pure gut health book. It was way too many things in it. For people who want to have a sort of a whole holistic view on this topic, I think that it's the right one. In terms of the hormonal cells or endocrine cells in the gut, most people don't realize. I mean, the gut is a very complex organ. I think we're just now the lay public is beginning to understand this. So it's not just has the biggest nervous system outside of the gut. It also has the biggest part of our immune system, and it has the biggest part of our endocrine system, which doesn't make sense right away because we don't see endocrine organs in there, but there's hundreds of thousands of cells interspersed with the gut cells throughout from the stomach all the way down to the end of the large intestine, and they all contain so it's up to 20 different kinds of hormones are stored in these cells. And one thing that we know the best about these hormones is they play a big role in the regulation of appetite and hunger. So the main mechanism that shuts off, sends a signal to the brain that it's time to stop eating after a meal is hormonal signals from these cells that reach part of the hypothalamus in the brain and turn off the the appetite. And there's only one that really drives appetite, so-called ghrelin in the stomach. that is an important driver of making us, having the motivation to eat something. Um, with your interest in, so let me first say, why they're there. I mean, they have been there for a long time. So
Mm.
if you go back in evolution, um, the first animals that lived in the oceans of the world were basically these floating digestive tubes, and they had an opening at one end and an opening at the other end, and things moved through. They had already a rudimentary nervous system, but they also had rudimentary endocrine cells in this digestive tube, um, and they signaled to the nerves that there was a nerve net around this digestive tube. So there was a communication between the endocrine cells and the nerve cells. These very primitive life forms, animal life forms. Um, so fast forward to today, I understand that you have a major interest in in the role of sex hormones and nutrition. What I can say, so this is not my primary expertise, but what I can say, a very fascinating topic is the role that the microbiome plays in the regulation of systemic blood levels of estrogens. So, estrogens are produced by the gonadal cells, um, by the ovaries, are secreted into the blood, circulated in the blood, are then processed or metabolized in the liver and excreted through a bile, and the bile goes into um, the second half of the small intestine, the ileum. Um, and then what happens there is that's when the microbes come into place, because the microbes, um, certain microbes can break down and modify these estrogen, these glucuronidized estrogen molecules, and turn them into absorbable molecules. So they're then being reabsorbed into the circulation. The amount of estrogens that are being reabsorbed from the gut, from the bile, depends on the composition of your microbes. So not every woman absorbs the same amount of estrogen back into the systemic circulation. And that introduces a big variable in terms of, like, post-menopause, for example, what the estrogen levels are. This also plays a big role, for example, in the processing of phytoestrogens, so the estrogens that we consume with our diet, plant-based diet. Soy, for example, um, has sort of received a lot of attention for this. So these phytoestrogens also require the same kind of microbial communities to break them down into absorbable molecules. So this means for a lot of people that eat a lot of tofu, they will not have an increase in the estrogen levels in the blood because they don't have the right microbes to break them down. Whereas for others, they have, and for many men, this is something they want to stay away from. For postmenopausal women, it's very something that that is of benefit. So the microbes and their individual composition do play a big role in the regulation of estrogen levels in the systemic circulation, in the physiology of our bodies.
It's so fascinating, and I want to move into the emotional part in a moment too, where something could be medicine for someone else because of their microbiome constitution, and poison potentially for someone else. And so I want to, before we get into the other topics, I have so many for you, as you know, I really want to ask you about something that a lot of women come to me with, is endometriosis. And so we see that it's not quite hormonal, it's not quite autoimmune, it's somewhere unidentified. So what are your thoughts on seeing the connection with autoimmune conditions, and the microbiome, and then something we see in endometriosis, for example?
So, I have to really pass on a scientific answer to that question. I have seen quite a few women with endometriosis in my practice, where I see a lot of patients with chronic abdominal pain, irritable bowel syndrome, and one differential diagnosis in women with these symptoms is endometriosis, and quite a few had surgeries for it.
Yeah.
And it's fairly easy to differentiate from other types of chronic abdominal pain because it has typically a cyclical nature. But quite honestly, when I saw women with this problem in my practice, this was the time before the microbiome. So I've not really followed up specifically this link that you were saying, microbiome, autoimmune disorders, and endometriosis. There's clearly a link between the exposure of our microbiome in our immune system early on in life, when basically the immune system is being trained to differentiate between good and bad, between the microbes that live in our gut and the things that we eat. And when the immune system has to kick in and sort of consider this a foreign invasion, which happens, these autoimmune conditions have increased in prevalence, and this has been related to a compromised training early on of the immune system, partly due to the excessive, there's the hygiene hypothesis and the excessive use of antibiotics, where we interfere with that training period early on in life, the first 3 years of life. Now, what role this plays in endometriosis, I would not be able to give you a good answer for.
I respect that because it's something that we are continually learning about. The science is always changing, and there's always something new to be found. And so I appreciate you making dots until the research that you have, and that's something to be explored because we don't know the answers yet. And
this is a problem in this field in general. A lot of people have over enthusiastically use microbiome science to explain things that up to recently we haven't been able to explain. It doesn't mean that it's the right answer. Just coming back to this disorder, irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. All of a sudden people say, oh, it's a microbiome disorder, but that's really not the case. There's the microbiome plays some role in it together with diet, but it's certainly not the cause. And we may see other areas. I mean, there's been a lot of brain disorders that have been linked now to the microbiome, and we sort of have to differentiate. We're still at a stage where we have to learn changes in the microbiome being associated with certain diseases versus the microbiome playing a causative role in these diseases. So that's a big question mark that needs to be answered. And I could imagine that something like this has happened. I mean, you may know this better than I do. That some of this may have happened in provocative articles and in the lay press, endometriosis as well. So.
And I think that you're right. It's like it can be correlation, but not causative. And that's the key word. You said the correlation there. And so on that note, one thing that is correlated that we have seen that you write extensively about, which I am very grateful, is the power of our emotional state on the impact of our gut health. Which do you think comes first? So like chicken or the egg question, is it our chronic emotions or the chronic gut imbalance that drive the emotion first?
Yeah, so I would say it's neither nor. It's a I always like this concept of a circular system to describe this interaction. And system is sort of the key word here. There's a whole field of system biology now and system theory where nodes in a network are connected by multiple arrows in both directions. So there's feedback loops. And any such system always has sort of like a circular, underlying circular structure. So in terms of emotions and the gut, spent a lot of time in my career studying the effect of of stress and emotions on the gut, and there's an extensive literature in this area. We know that even specific emotions, negative emotions like anger or fear, anxiety, what pattern they create in the gut in terms of contractions and secretions and blood flow. This goes back 100 years. But there's also a lot of evidence now. We started this about 15, 20 years ago, that the sensory information from the gut plays a big role in influencing. So the signals that go back from the gut to the brain into emotional areas play a big role in modifying the way we feel. So this whole field of gut feelings or gut sensations obviously plays a very big role. So the way I would summarize it, in terms of emotions, I think the overwhelming evidence is that there's early in life an interaction of genetics with epigenetics. There's sort of a programming of the brain to react to stress differently, and that sets up a whole vulnerability throughout life for great anxiety, then great depression. But these influences from the brain on the gut have a profound effect on, as I mentioned, on contractions, blood flow, transit rates. And now that we know there's microbes there, which we didn't know, 10 years ago. Now we also know that these emotional influences change the environment for the microbes and can actually change directly the behavior and the gene expression of some microbes. And then they produce different molecules. The molecules get into the bloodstream and act either through the vagus nerve or get into the bloodstream, act directly on the brain. Or a third possibility, that these changes in the gut microbes and the gut permeability through stress and a negative emotion actually change the immune system activation and cause this low-grade immune activation. So there's multiple pathways that the microbes standing between the emotional influence and the rest of our body can play a role in modifying, our emotional makeup. To what degree each of these components, the central and the peripheral, plays a role in how we can modulate them remains to be determined until we have figured this out. So like in my practice, I always sort of treat this in a holistic way, with medications targeted at this increased stress responsiveness of the brain, with mindfulness-based stress reduction or cognitive behavioral therapy, and with dietary intervention. So I think if you address all three arms of this, you basically address this complex circular system of brain gut microbiome and back to the brain communication.
I love that because it is a holistic strategy to go over what's going on physically and as well as emotionally. Because the same thing is like when we get embarrassed or angry, our face flushes and our heart rate increases, our muscles contract, right? And so we're having the same experience in our gut. Can you walk us through, the what's happening in the body, in the brain, and in the gut when let's say we meet someone and we have a bad gut feeling, and then, is it what's happening? You speak about this in your book for those who have not read it yet.
Well, it's a complex topic. So there's definitely one thing, what the brain does when it it confronts a new situation, which is this general arousal. So arousal is sort of value neutral. It can, this activity of the brain is triggered by falling in love, getting excited, going in a first date, but also feeling threatened. And it's sort of non-specific, really, and we know the mechanisms that located in the brainstem that modulate the excitability of the whole brain. So that is also associated with gut sensations. So this whole thing, butterflies in the stomach, kind of famous, is probably the manifestation of that kind of arousal, because you could have it when you're afraid of giving a talk, or you could have it when you fall in love with somebody. So that's kind of easily explainable. It's something happens in the brain, signal goes down to the gut, changes the contractions of the gut, and your sensors that your gut is studied, sensors feeds it back to the brain. So it's kind of a simple loop that goes on. Now with gut feelings, it's a more complicated thing, because we all have gone through life from the time we're born with being exposed to different experiences, emotional experiences. And these emotional experiences are encoded. This is what I proposed in my book. These are encoded as these video clips of emotional moments that we have gone through. From the first time we were hungry as a baby, a negative emotion, to the first time we were satiated because we were breastfed. There's such a complex machinery to record these through our sensory system, the gut, and then feeding back to the brain. That there must be this purpose of recording every event, just as if you sign up for Netflix or for Google, that's the system gets to know you better and better based on all your experiences that you have had and that feed back into the system. So as a teenager or as an adult, you have this vast database in your brain, this supercomputer that has access to a tremendous amount of data storage. And so we've learned all these systems through our technology. So we have data warehouses for Amazon and Google have these gigantic places. So this is where we store all these emotional moments. And what happens if you have to make a decision, particularly if it's a quick decision? So either it's a very quick decision, you don't have time to think about it for a long time, or if it's so complex that you just cannot, like a career decision or relationship decision, then what your brain does, it doesn't use the rational decision-making process. It's very cumbersome. And with plus and minus lists and then make a decision. But it actually accesses this database just like a supercomputer does within milliseconds. Just the way you type in the first two letters of a word on Google, and it creates this question that fits you. That's sort of what I've used as an example that our brain does. So depending on your database of all these emotional moments, you can make this gut-based decision, which often, not always, is the best decision for you based on. Now, if you had a very traumatic upbringing and youth and childhood, that system has a lot of these negative emotional moments in it, and it will, it's biased towards making decisions that are more, that assume a greater likelihood of a negative outcome. So you're not going to make the same. So this gut-based decision system is best for people that have grown up healthy, positive emotions, reinforcement from the parents, and it will make the best decisions for you. And I've always said you can train that. If you realize you are somebody who has this negative bias. So cognitive behavioral therapy basically aims to correct that. So, you anyway, so long story, a very complicated system. I think as our computers and our technology advances, this model will probably be replaced in 10, 20 years by whatever happens in our virtual worlds and what devices and gadgets we come up with as humans. But I think right now this technological analogy and image fits pretty well. I think what happens.
It's powerful because I almost go back to this is we know so much. This is what we know so far. This is what the data shows, and it's open to changing. And so I have an interesting question that I've been pondering as we've been seeing in like the female beauty industry. We see the rise of Botox or plastic surgery. And I'm very curious because we know that Botox is a neurotoxin already. And then I haven't experienced this myself yet or at all, but when I've heard that some women, when they get Botox, they're not able to make facial expressions as clearly. And so if you're not able to smile in a certain way or frown in a certain way, would that then impact your gut emotions or your gut health if you're not able to express a certain emotion?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. I have to say, I've not been asked that question, but obviously it's very much related. So I've compared the facial expression of emotions to the gut expressions of emotions, and they're kind of mirror images. We can never see our inside. You have to do sophisticated research experiments to actually see that. But you can assume if you didn't see the face of somebody and you're trained of looking at a gut of a person that's angry or fearful or that you could make that diagnosis just by looking at the gut, not looking at the person or listening to the person. So if you interfere with this, it certainly will have an effect on the other person that you're interacting with. So our facial emotions and the systems we have to recognize and interpret these emotions are very important. We've been, researchers have been using images of facial expressions in a lot of research studies, and it's a universal thing. You can show the same facial emotion to somebody in a tribal community in Africa or on the Amazon River, and they will have the same brain response to these facial emotions. So if you interfere with those and you reduce them or modify them, it certainly will have an effect on the other person reacting to that. And I don't know, I don't know if it also has an effect on the person that is expressing those emotions through their face. I could imagine, the same thing would be true about the gut. If you, there are unfortunate patients who lose the majority of their gut early on in life because they have either a malformation or it has to be, resected as an emergency. And they don't have the ability to express gut emotion, gut reactions in their gut. Many of these patients have emotional disturbances. At some point in my career, some 15 years ago, we once planned a study to look at that, but it's very difficult because children that undergo these operations, yes, they all have behavioral problems, but there's so many factors. It could be that they haven't been able to the normal oral stimulation with food intake because they have to be fed intravenously from early on. So we decided it's too complex a question that can be addressed in humans scientifically. And I'm not aware that people have studied this in animals either. But there's definitely indications that interference or removal of this the gut-based emotion expression system may have an effect on your emotional makeup and brain development, um, and it's conceivable. I mean, I don't know. You know, when I look at these TV commercials that, um, you know, very young, so you would always think that this whole Botox um, uh, craze is really something that that you know, women in middle age or older women would use to look younger, but the commercials actually promote this for young women, which is
Yeah.
you know, is sort of really shocking to me. Um, that this could have a totally unexpected, you know, effect on the emotional um, you know, makeup and on the emotional health of young women who, you know, who do this. So very interesting question.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. I'm not even 30 yet, but I have women friends that are younger than me and doing Botox now. And I think about the health side of it, right? And I not just the neurotoxin, but then now after reading your book, I was thinking, does this have an impact on emotions and then gut health later on? And so on that note, you also talk about in your book the philosophical question of, if we eat something when we're celebrating someone's birthday or graduation, do you think that if we have a food sensitivity and we eat that food when we're in a sense of celebration and harmony, versus if we are, you know, overeating because we're depressed or whatever it is, does that make a physical shift in what's going on in the gut?
Yeah, I mean, I can't prove it because, you know, the as a scientist, so if I wear my scientists hat, then I would say, you know, we don't have the hard studies to really prove that. On the other hand, there's a lot of information and studies have come out about the powerful effect of these mind states on a variety of things. So, you know, let's just start with the food sensitivities. Um, that you know, there's this whole issue about the nocebo and the placebo effects,
Mm-hmm.
which for a physician, it's always sort of the things. The placebo effect has sort of a negative bytone because it sort of is hiding the real effect of drugs, which is not really true, because even the most powerful drugs have a very powerful placebo effect, explaining more than half,
Hmm.
you know, at least half of their effectiveness, and that includes, you know, narcotics and
Hmm.
morphine and some of the most powerful drugs. The nocebo effect, that which is sort of the, you know, the mirror image, that if we have an expectation of something that is associated with a bad gut response, a gut reaction, a bad feeling in general, is tremendously powerful, and in my opinion, can probably explain a lot of what's currently, you know, this epidemic of food sensitivities. And I always put non-celiac gluten sensitivity on the top of this.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, as a gastroenterologist, celiac disease has been increasing in prevalence, and it has to do something what we talked about earlier, the training of our immune system.
Yeah.
It's one of these autoimmune diseases. Um, so that there's hard science to confirm this. But then there's been this explosion of non-celiac disease gluten sensitivity, in my opinion, fueled initially by a couple of best-selling books, and then a whole multi-billion-dollar industry that's built around it.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're in a situation that, you know, you look at a bottled water plastic bottle and it says gluten-free on it, you know, which is a
Mm-hmm.
totally sandy, but it does respond to this, because a customer would look at this, anything that they buy now, and see, is it gluten-free, not even
Mm-hmm.
thinking, you know. So in my opinion, and there's some good studies that have really supported this, if the person doesn't know um, that a particular food item has gluten in it, you know, but they say they're gluten sensitive, that they will not have any negative responses to it. So I think the mind is very powerful to it. and it's not just psychologically. So, both the placebo and the nocebo effect activate the brain systems
Mm.
that send signals down to the gut. We have these sensors in the gut, and we have the immune cells, and the brain through the autonomic nervous system can regulate the sensitivity of these sensors, um, and then trigger reactions, which are again mirror images of what goes on within your brain. So you could almost say, you asked me this question about the gut feelings in the beginning. Um, the gut feelings extend, and the sort of negative bias of gut feelings. If you go through the world with you, your brain evaluating everything that you do and that you eat, particularly what you eat, with, there's a system in the brain called the salient system that assesses is something good or bad for you, is something threatening, or is it benign? If that system is biased towards attributing more threatening value to things that you eat or that go on inside your gut, you your brain will then send these signals to the gut, and you will experience these symptoms, and it's definitely an area that's not psychological. It has a psychological dimension, but it has, I think, if you understand it with this concept of the brain gut axis, you can't really make that separation. I think it's, and in some ways, it goes in a positive direction also. If you have an expectation that, yeah, like all the positive events, the social events, that social, in some countries of the world, well, probably most countries of the world, we have celebrations that always involve food, and
Mhm.
um, the food tastes particularly good during these, even the food that you shouldn't be eating, the sweets, and they taste particularly good during these events. And
Yeah.
um, if you ate the same food when you alone and depressed, you probably feel lousy after eating,
Yeah.
a lot of sweets. So I think um, it's a difficult area um, to convince somebody. These belief systems are very powerful, and it's, once they are programmed and ingrained, it's very difficult to convince somebody that they're limiting their own range of experiences. Um, and the bad thing is, like, all these experiences that you perceive as negative always come along with anxiety, with,
Mhm.
and so you go through life and through the experience of eating always with a background of anxiety, um, which again we know influences, activities in your gut, and it's not a healthy way of doing it. Um,
What is really the epitome of it all, it sounds like, is the connection. While there, and when you talk about this as well, the systems, it's all a system, whether it's the thoughts first and then the feeling and then the what we're eating and all of that, it's all connected. And so, we talked a lot about a variety of topics, and listeners can go to your book, very relevant to today's time, and it's a page turner. Again, you don't need to be a scientist to learn about your body, learn about the book. So I recommend that. But you also have your next book coming out. Can you tell us where people can find you and how they can pre-order the book?
So they can order it on, it's also been published by HarperCollins, so on the HarperCollins website, or, most people order it on Amazon. You can go to Amazon now and pre-order this book. Um, it's in many ways, it builds obviously on the basis of the first one, but it goes further, and goes into various, brain diseases. It's an update on what has happened by the time it comes out, it's 5 years after the first one. A lot
Mhm.
of science has happened. Um, Goes a little bit more into these neurodegenerative diseases, that I personally find, um, are equally important, maybe even important as we age. cognitive decline is a big topic now, I'm sure in your activities as well. People are very concerned of what they eat. Does that accelerate or slow cognitive decline, even if you don't develop Alzheimer's disease, but just the normal age-related. And I strongly believe that that's the case. We're probably some of the best science that goes on in humans. So we're involved in a big consortium, international consortium, that looks at thousands of patients, their microbiome, their cognitive function, their brain function. And to me, this is definitely an area where in the next 10 years, we'll look at cognitive decline in a very different way. Right now, our main intervention, I emphasize this in the book, is based on diet, because we don't have any magic pills, that particularly in prevention. But there will be at some point in the future, will we also have medications to interfere with some of these processes. And I should also mention that one thing that I got really interested in, going beyond the gut. So when we talk about diet, and again, it goes more into your territory as a nutritionist. Obviously what we eat, it's not just what we eat, it's also where this food comes from and how it's being produced, and particularly how is it grown? How is plant-based food grown? And then there's this fascinating story, that the microbes in the soil have a big word to say. They interact with the root system of the plants. And I made this analogy. It's almost like the soil microbes, the way they interact with what's called the rhizosome, the roots of the plant. It's a very similar, like an analogous system, how our gut microbes interact with our gut lining, so a good example of how nature has come up with a design principle and then kept it. Now, this is very important. It's not just for scientists fascinating that we have a similar system, but it's also like the nutrient content of our plants, of our plant-based food, is crucially dependent on these soil microbes. And as we have been destroying not just our gut microbes with antibiotics and medications and sterile environments, we've done, industrial agriculture has done exactly the same thing to the soil. And so you may have the illusion that you're a vegetarian, you live the healthiest, you eat the healthiest food, but the food that you eat is actually depleted in these nutrients like polyphenols, particularly, that play a big role in not just gut health, but also, brain health.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And that's something that I get really, really jazzed about, is the microbiome of our gut and then the microbiome of the soil. And so it's a whole other rabbit hole, and I'm so glad that you brought this up. And this is something that we will be continuing to explore as humanity and people who are interested in health and wellness in many facets. So thank you so very much for being on the show today. I will link to your website and where people can pre-order the book. Is there anything else that you would love for listeners to know?
Well, I could just say, in summary, first of all, it was a very, stimulating conversation with you. I think I've talked to many hosts, so this has definitely been one of the most stimulating conversations on this topic. My own enthusiasm, as having done science for and seen individual patients for the most part of my career, or the last 40 years, this writing the book, publishing the book, and getting the message out to a much, much larger audience has become my main goal at this stage of my life. And it's been very rewarding and very exciting to reach audiences that I would have never reached. I've sort of gotten tired to tell my colleagues about this. So first of all, for 35 years, nobody listened to it or was interested in it. And now with the microbiome, some of my colleagues are interested in this area. But as a gastroenterologist, never having been trained in nutrition, um, and if anything, having been told, well, if there's a problem with nutrition, refer the patient to a nutritionist. That for me is sort of an amazing, so this realization that one of the most important parts of our gut health and our brain health, that this is being left out of the curriculum and the education, that realization has been amazing. So it's exciting now to have the opportunities like talking to you and your audiences about this and spreading the word. I think that's, it's really exciting and important to me.
It is very exciting and important. And thank you for the work that you do. Really appreciate your time, Dr. Mayer. And I look forward to seeing your next book and reading it and sharing it with our audience. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Celine. Great.